Frost at Midnight.
Thank you. The evolution of Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Frost at Midnight. Because Samuel Taylor Coleridge is a romantic author who had a lengthy career, readers can follow the development of his outlook through the various stages of his life. Also, Coleridge's unusual habit of revising his poetry and republishing it over the course of his career can allow readers to understand this development through the different published versions of his poems. The early part of Coleridge's career is a more radical time in his life when he followed a segment of the Unitarian religion that emphasized the importance of David Hartley's book, Observations on Man, especially Hartley's theories on how the process of association works to generate ideas. As Coleridge's career progresses, however, his views shift from a more radical Unitarianism that emphasized Hartley's observations to a more orthodox belief system. This shift can be seen in the different published versions of the poem Frost at Midnight, which was written and originally published in the late 1790s, revised and republished later in the middle of Coleridge's career, and reworked and reissued again late in his career when the poem's references to perception and imagination reflected the ideas he develops in his Biographia Literaria. Coleridge is first acquainted with this type of Unitarianism at Cambridge. A leading Unitarian supporter named Joseph Priestley had made necessary views of the Unitarian with David Hartley's book, Observations on Man, and in this version of the religion, the book is thought of as being second only to the Bible. One of Hartley's preoccupations is with sensory perception and the way our brain associates these perceptions to generate ideas, action, and thought. He develops a theory involving automatic actions, voluntary actions, and secondarily automatic actions that are interdependent on one another through the process of association. The marriage of Unitarian views with Observations on Man was accomplished primarily through Hartley's admission that the Unitarian doctrine of necessity follows from that of association. He believes necessity overrules the randomness of the world and acts as the means of God's providential plan, a plan in which all people, without exception, will be members in the mystical body of Christ. This group of Unitarians interpreted this to mean that the idea of free will fits into a predetermined design by God, and that regardless of an individual's action, the result would always be in accord with God's wishes, thus relieving the individual of any guilt. Coleridge shares this viewpoint in his earlier years in a letter to his brother. Guilt is out of the question. I am a necessarian and of course deny the possibility of it. More orthodox viewpoints see this as taking away free will and the removal of moral responsibility, a claim Coleridge would make himself later in life. The first version of Frost at Midnight was published in March 1798 when Coleridge regularly took part in preaching sermons to the Unitarian congregation and pursued the position of the vacant ministry at Shrewsbury. These circumstances make it important to consider the influence of Observations on Man on the first version of Frost at Midnight. The most revised portion of the poem is found at the end of the first paragraph. Lines 20 through 31 of the original version read, out of thought. But still, the living spirit in our frame that loves not to behold a lifeless thing transfuses into all its own delights, its own volition, sometimes with deep faith and sometimes with fantastical playfulness. Ah me, amused by no such curious toys of the self-watching, subtilizing mind, how often in my early schoolboy days, with most believing superstitious wish, presageful, have I gazed upon the bars, to watch the stranger there. When reading these lines with regard to Hartley's influence on Coleridge, the poem clearly presents this absence of a governing will. Coleridge uses deep faith and fantastical playfulness as predetermined influences over the process of association, and the will is only the idea or action generated through that process. The out of thought Coleridge is experiencing represents a mind absent of associations and ideas, and therefore absent of a will. Also important in the original version of the poem are the last 6 lines of the poem that Coleridge later removed. Like those, my babe, which ere tomorrow's warmth have capped their sharp keen points and pendulous drops, will catch thine eye, and with their novelty suspend thy little soul, then make thee shout, and stretch and flutter from thy mother's arms, as thou wouldst fly for very eagerness. Hartley believed the relationship between beast and man to be very close. He claims, I always suppose that corresponding feelings and affections of the mind attend upon them, just as in us, and that brute creatures prove their near relation to us, not by the general resemblance of body, but by that of the mind also. This leads to Hartley's conclusion that both animals and humans are born with instinct. The actions and reactions of babes and beasts are instinctual or automatic actions, and in the pre-linguistic stage of infancy, the relationship between babe and beast is very close. It is important to note that the poem begins with the voiced nonverbal cry of an owlet in the first 3 lines of the poem and ends with the voiced nonverbal shout of the babe. Coleridge also makes comparison to the owlet in the way the babe would fly for very eagerness. Neither can fly, but both are seeking ways to express this eagerness. Coleridge is using the shout of the babe, which is an echo of the cry of the owlet, to represent the voiced nonverbal, and this shows the influence of Hartley's ideas about the kinship between man and beast on the original version of the poem. The second distinct version of Frost at Midnight is the version published in 1812. The most obvious change to the poem may be the removal of the final 6 lines. This removal is a reflection of Coleridge's conversion to a Trinitarian form of Christianity in 1805. Anglicanism believes that our superior intellect and ability were granted by God at creation, and we are designed to be superior. In Coleridge's newfound Christianity, the close kinship between the Owlet and the babe has been fundamentally destroyed, leaving not only a destruction of the rondo, but a destruction of the meaning of a poem that contains these final 6 lines. The end of the first verse paragraph of 1812 version also found itself under revision. Lines 20 through 33 now read, "Haply hence, that still the living spirit in our frame, which loves not to behold a lifeless thing, transfuses into all things its own will and its own pleasures, sometimes with deep faith and sometimes with willful playfulness, that stealing pardon from our childish thought that flit about, oft go and oft return not uninvited. Ah, there was a time, when oft amused by no such soul toys of the self-watching mind, a child at school, with most believing superstitious wish, presageful have I gazed upon the bars to watch the stranger there." Coleridge removes the reference to idle thought and uses the word will for the first time in the 1812 publication. He does this in an attempt to introduce to the poem a governing faculty of the mind. Coleridge explains Hartley's idea of the will as a broad stream, winding through a mountain country with an indefinite number of currents, varying and running into each other according as the gusts chance to blow from the mountains. The temporary union of 7 currents in one, so as to form the main current of the moment, would present an accurate image of Hartley's theory. In this theory, the will isn't a governing faculty, but the result of many forces coming together at a given time. This shift away from Hartley's idea of the will is necessary in Coleridge's newfound faith that believes very much in the concept of choice and free will along with moral responsibility. During the time period between the publication of the second and third distinct versions of Frost at Midnight, Coleridge writes Biographia Literaria. The book, published in 1817, is important when looking closely at the evolution of the author and his ideas. In chapters 5, 6, and 7, Coleridge explains the history of associationism from Aristotle to Hartley, as well as his own conclusions on the topic. He makes the statement that Hartley differed from Aristotle only to err. This difference, Coleridge explains, is simply that Aristotle labels 5 occasioning causes for association and lists contemporaneity as the common condition by which association takes place. Coleridge claims that Hartley, on the other hand, labels contemporaneity as the cause of association and the sole law of association. He then goes on to make the statement, "The air I breathe is the condition of my life, not its cause." This analogy Coleridge cleverly applies to Hartley's theory on contemporaneity as the sole law of association, in that a person may hold his or her breath for a short period of time, but must breathe in much the same way contemporaneity is temporarily absent, allowing the will to work through the fancy, with the fancy being no more than a mode of memory emancipated from time and place. After the publication of Biographia Literaria, the final version of Frost at Midnight is published in 1834. Peculiar to this version of the poem is how Coleridge has omitted the footnote to line 15 pertaining to the film on the grate. The footnote originally reads, "In all parts of the kingdom, these films are called strangers, and supposed to portend the arrival of some absent friend." In addition to removing the footnote, Coleridge also revised the poem from "a child at school with most believing superstitious wish" to "how oft at school with most believing mind." With these revisions, he removes any language of superstition, which relegates the film on the grate to a mere catalyst for his imagination or believing mind. Also, by removing the footnote or any language of superstition, Coleridge removes any solid connection between the two recollections in the poem, thus removing any signs of contemporaneity between the memories that may have existed. This should be seen as symbolic of Coleridge's move from the unproven theories of Hartley or superstitions to the imagination of his most believing mind. Many current editions of Frost at Midnight have the footnote restored to the poem, but the inclusion of the footnote should be strongly considered in light of Coleridge's removal of it and revisions made to the final publication. The end of the first paragraph has also gone a major revision and condensation. The final version reads, "Methinks, its motion in this hush of nature gives it dim sympathies with me who live, making it a companionable form, whose puny flaps and freaks the idling spirit by its own mood interprets, everywhere echo or mirror seeking of itself, and makes a toy of thought. But oh, how oft at school with most believing mind presageful have I gazed upon the bars to watch that fluttering stranger." The echo or mirror seeking of itself matches his description of the secondary imagination in Biographia Literaria that is an echo of the primary imagination, because Biographia Literaria seems to have been written with the notion that his conclusions would explain the evolution of his ideas. If the entire passage from Biographia Literaria is read, it echoes the final version of the much amended ending to the first verse paragraph. The secondary imagination I consider as an echo of the primary, coexisting with the conscious will, yet still is identical with the primary in the kind of its agency and differing only in degree and in the mode of its operation. It dissolves, diffuses, dissipates in order to recreate, but when this process is rendered impossible, yet still at all events it struggles to idealize and to unify. The statement addresses not only the secondary imagination's origin, but also the way the mind continues attempting to create through the secondary imagination, even when it is impossible. The never-ending struggle to create in a state of mind absent of new material for creation, paired with his inadequacy in finding a way to define this process, is what makes a toy of thought. Hartley's theory of association and the relationship between the automatic, voluntary, and secondarily automatic actions have driven Coleridge's view of the primary and secondary imagination coexisting with the will. This idea of an unceasing secondary imagination then governs the final revision to Frost at Midnight. This romantic author has shown no fear in changing his outlook on philosophy or reservations about revising his poetry to fit these changing perspectives. In looking at the three major versions of Frost at Midnight in context with his views at those particular times in his life, the evolution of Coleridge from the radical Unitarian to a more orthodox religious view, and the influence of Hartley on him throughout the course of this evolution are undeniable. While David Hartley has had a profound influence on one of the most well-known poets of the past 2 centuries, the philosopher only acted as fuel for that inquisitive fire that burned within the mind of Samuel Taylor Coleridge.